In this series' first video, second if you count the amazing intro, a video by a YouTuber, Chaosism, is taken and critiqued. Chaosism made the video critiquing Kent Hovind on the most basic facts concerning evolution. How much he got right? To see, let us begin.
Right here.
I asked the professor, I said, do you believe you came from a rock? He refused to answer the question. I think it was 10 times I asked him during the course of the debate. And I showed right from his textbook, 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth cooled down and developed a hard, rocky crust. And then it rained on the rocks for millions of years and created great oceans, which, of course, is going to contain dissolved minerals from the rocks. And then these minerals slowly got together and formed life, and then that became humans. So we came from a rock. That is exactly what they believe. They just don't like it. They don't like it pointed out so simply because it shows how just flat stupid that is.
Firstly, what you're trying to refer to here is abiogenesis, not evolution. That's another topic, so I won't cover that here. Secondly, the theory of evolution doesn't concern itself with the origin of life. As long as life had some origin, then evolution can occur. In science, theories pertain to specific matters and aren't directly related or necessarily dependent on other theories, such as the relationship between evolution and abiogenesis. Let's look at three categories that are commonly referenced in these debates: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the diversity of life. These are three entirely separate categories from each other. Biblical creation covers all three of these topics with one single overarching creation account. In contrast, science deals with each of these topics individually, and these theories are not directly dependent on one another. People can have their own beliefs, and for example, one can believe that God created life, pertaining to the origin of life, while evolution still occurred, albeit guided or invented by God. This is exactly what enables such a belief as theistic evolution. In conclusion, Kent's rock believer statements don't pertain to evolution at all.
To understand Kent's view, a little bit clip would offer help.
Evolution has 6 different meanings. First, you'd have to have cosmic evolution, the origin of time-space matter. Secondly, you'd have to have chemical evolution. The hydrogen from the Big Bang would have to evolve to all 92 elements, plus the synthetic ones. Then you'd have to have what we call stellar evolution. The stars would have to evolve. And nobody's ever seen a star form. We see them blow up all the time. And yet there's enough stars out there that everybody on planet Earth can own 2 trillion of them to yourself. Those are the ones we know about. We don't know about the ones we don't know about. Then we'd have to have what we call organic evolution, the origin of life. Nobody has a clue how life can get started from non-living material. We'll cover more on that in the next session, about the origin of life. Next, they have what's called macroevolution, changing from one kind of animal into another. Nobody's ever seen a dog produce a non-dog. And lastly, we have variations within the kind that some people call microevolution. Okay, this one happens, whatever you call it, it happens. The first 5 are purely religious. But the definition of the word evolution is really confused for the students on purpose, I believe. I think it takes a giant leap of faith and logic just to go from micro to macro. Sure takes a big leap to go to the other 4 stages. Macroevolution is a fantasy based on imagination. They believe it must have happened, but there is no evidence for it at all. Teachers, though, will give the students one definition of the word to get them to believe the theory, and then they slowly weed in the rest of it when they're not looking. They're going to say, evolution is descent with modification. That's deceitful. That's not really what they mean by evolution. This textbook says, evolution is change over time. First definition. Watch how they change the definition now. In other words, living things have changed over time. Wait a minute. What happened to the first 4 stages? You're going to skip all the way down to living things and just assume the first 4 happened?
Did you catch the word assume? The first critique is based on that. One of the major rifts in the whole creation versus evolution debate is the question about defining terms. In a debate, generally both sides mutually agree to a common definition, unless the debate itself is about definitions. Evolutionists' main critiques of Kent often involve questioning some form of semantics and criticism of his non-understanding of their definitions. This hardly makes sense because Kent happily rejects their authority, and thus any such claims would be arguments from authority. To carry this discussion forward, let us take a simple assertion that Hovind implies and use it as a baseline to weigh in criticisms. To understand how this claim is important and why evolutionists many criticisms of Hovind are arguments from authority, you may like to check a video that explains this. Evolution by its very nature assumes a pre-existing life form on which the process underlying acts to create the new organism. Without the pre-existing life form capable of undergoing process which undergirds evolution, evolution is not possible. Backtracking the whole tree of life, one passes through points of convergence, and at each level the span of tree becomes shorter, which is what one would expect. Evolutionists, however, hypothesize that at the tip of the tree there exists a single common ancestor, somewhat like the singularity of Big Bang. Without the presence of this ancestor, which has necessary components to enable evolutionary processes to work, none of the future life forms would be possible. Yet why not trace this life form further back to another point of convergence if such exists? Evolutionists would stop the buck at the first life and often claim that anything else is inorganic and thus outside the purview of evolution and biology, speaking strictly. This may indeed be semantically valid, but Hovind is not concerned about what this evolution entails. He cares about the validity of the model. While evolutionists may not put the origin of life under bounds of evolutionary study, it is possible that they have beliefs regarding the origin of life, because they need it for the whole theory to be able to explain the observed diversity sufficiently. And it is not that they did not have such beliefs. Darwin himself wrote that life may have begun in a warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. He went on to explain that at present day, such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were formed. As the first life form is an important ingredient to answer the puzzle of diversity, such explanation is needed, at least as needed as atheists wanting a proof of God to believe that world is designed. From an atheist perspective, both the theories, evolution and teleological argument, invoke unproven entities, one a primordial life form of which we have no evidence and one an ethereal being. The difference, however, is that while there are independent arguments and evidences to prove existence of God, though one may reject them, there are no independent arguments or evidences to prove existence of the first common ancestor, especially if we throw all theories of origin outside ambit of evolution. One may immediately say that we infer the common ancestor from our backtracking of evolutionary process and phylogenetic tree, and they are indeed right, except for a small caveat. The whole reasoning is a reasoning in a big circle, the first big circle of evolutionary reasoning. A common ancestor is inferred from observing the life forms and backtracking them via evolutionary principles, but the same common ancestor is required to produce the life forms through evolutionary processes. Like a snake biting its own tail, the circle is not just vacuous, but vicious. The person who rejects a first common ancestor will not be convinced by sufficiency of evolution, and one who rejects the sufficiency of evolution will not be convinced by invoking a common ancestor. An illustration to prove this is: assume a hypothesis or a theory that works on a particular input to produce an output. For a non-adequate input, a false input, even if the theory is true, it will produce a different output, designated as false because it does not match reality. However, as one knows what output is, one cannot be sure whether the problem is in theory, problem of insufficiency or falsity, or input itself, unless he has an independent way to test it. So how can he have faith in the theory? By what measure? Darwin later rubbished the idea of thinking about origin of life in a letter to a friend, J.D. Hooker, and compared it to the origin of matter. Darwin, ignoring previous discussion, expresses similar sentiment to that of Craig and seems to make a reasonable point. Here is Craig explaining why requiring explanation of explanation is problematic.
In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. In fact, when you think about it, if in order to recognize an explanation as the best, you have to have an explanation of the explanation, that leads immediately to an infinite regress. You need to have an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so on to infinity. You would never have an explanation of anything, which would destroy science.
However, is a demand from Darwinists akin to demanding infinitely regressing explanations, or even akin to hypothesizing origin of matter? The answer is a strict no. Imagine a time-varying graph showing development of species under abiogenesis, starting from a rock to a first life form and then to the first life form found in fossil records. Now imagine the same graph, however, in which the first life form found in fossil records or its close predecessor is actually the first life form. On the same scale of time, fitting these two phenomena would involve that we have to vary something else. To understand better, consider a runner who covers some amount of distance in a known time, say 10 seconds. Under a particular theory, if we assume that he started from a point around tip of the wedge, the distance comes to about, say, 100 meters, and his speed to be 10 meters per second. However, if that runner did not start from the tip of the wedge, but from somewhere in between, let us say about 20 meters away from the initially thought point, then the distance covered comes to about 80 meters in the same 10 seconds, and his speed comes to be just about 8 meters per second. Could this runner have, with this speed, sufficiently covered all the wedge on its own? The graph here shows what this is all about. Evolution with natural origin, meaning that by abiogenesis or by panspermia involving inorganic compounds, has a larger slope. If a theistic origin is assumed or life is assumed to be created or transferred, then the long-term rate of evolution has to be a lot lower. Yet when someone entertains this possibility, then he also entertains the possibility of rapid influx of new information, not at a single point, but distributed or discrete at several points, shown by bumps. This is, however, the theory of intelligent design. While theistic origin is compatible with Darwinian or neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, intelligent design isn't. Hence, the origin of life is indeed an important question, and the above is mathematical reason why.
Do you prefer that a heroic knight defeat a dragon or an imagined version of that dragon? Unfortunately for Kent, he's attacking the imagined version of evolution.
Did Hovind create a straw man? No, as the question of origin is related deeply to the question of sufficiency of evolution, as the theory is assumed to work in a time-bound limit equaling age of Earth, whatever that may be, and hence different points of origin affect the long-term rate of change severely, affecting evolution's explanatory power drastically. Onward to second objection.
Nobody's ever seen a dog produce a non-dog. Never. And they won't.
Firstly, let's take a look at this specific definition of macroevolution that Kent has here. Based on general usage and Kent's quote here, this entails one form of organism giving birth or changing into a radically different form of organism. One such example would be describing a crocodile giving birth to a duck. This is intentionally defined in a way to specifically make it seem absurd, because it is. Nowhere in evolutionary theory does it claim that such a radical transformation occurs, even with the inclusion of the notion of a transitional form. That is a separate issue that's constantly misrepresented and misunderstood, but that is another topic. The bottom line here is that evolution completely agrees with this being an absurd statement. This cannot happen, and if ever this was observed and proven to happen, that would deal a potentially lethal blow to the theory of evolution. Religious opponents of evolution actually have it backwards, for if they did find anything like this, this would be evidence of something besides evolution. Now, to address Kent's quote, it's quite absurd to say that evolution claims that a dog can produce a non-dog. Such a statement is made from an utter lack of understanding of a classification system. To demonstrate this is a generic example of a lineage. Each level that is shown represents an identifiable difference between lineages, and as you can see, the divergence adds new classifications. It does not affect or remove the original. So no matter what level you attribute to the classification of kind, you will never see one kind turning into another kind. The only thing that changes is the addition of more refined classifications to explain these differences. Evolution does not claim a dog can produce a non-dog. That's absurd.
One kind cannot change to second kind? So what is this? Drum roll. Before you think that this example is spurious, are you sure that you have the right understanding of phylogenetic tree? Moving from layman understanding of evolution presented willfully in textbooks and online, one realizes that the whole concept of phylogenetic tree is more absurd and arbitrary than one thinks. What a phylogenetic tree is anyways? A definition of it runs as follows. A phylogenetic tree or evolutionary tree is a branching diagram or tree showing the inferred evolutionary relationships among various biological species or other entities, their phylogeny, based upon similarities and differences in their physical or genetic characteristics. Did you notice the word inferred? Assume a hypothetical tree, a tree showing actual evolutionary relationships. Would this be exactly same to a phylogenetic? There are in fact three types of phylogenetic trees, at least in concept. Morphological trees classify living organisms based on their physical and functional characteristics. DNA-based trees on basis of DNAs. However, they both are different than true tree or species tree, which marks the actual way in which species diversify. If theory of evolution is true, then species tree is an actual historical fact and not a theoretical concept or its result. It is true one kind cannot change into another kind considering species tree for the simple reason that such is an actual historical fact and except by going back in time it cannot be changed. The point however is not that, the point is whether the theory of evolution allows for that possibility. If the theory allows for it while such is not possible in real life, does not that mean that theory allows a potential absurdity? The ancestor of hippopotamus, whoever it was most probably a land animal, according to evolutionists, and according to morphological tree, and how Kent classifies animals would be placed as separate kind than males due to large differences in morphology and functional characteristics. So it could be a potential example of one kind changing to another kind. How would one know it is not unless he knows actual facts regarding how evolution took place, in which the theory becomes more useless than it is currently because its utility is in shedding light on unknown. Now one may seek some respite in DNA trees, and here they commit the grossest mistake of all time. Assume a hypothetical phylogenetic tree of names, where each further classification level is farther than the predecessor by 10 significant mutations, while on the breadth it is about 5 mutations. Following the journey of Futurama meme along red and green lines, which of these transformations requires less number of mutations? Evolution is an omnidirectional process. As it involves random mutations, it can occur in any direction. Assume all set of possible mutations from a point along a sphere or a circle. The next mutation can occur along any path, a path that can be opposite to the initial path traversed. Yes, evolution allows for a crocodile to turn into a duck and an eagle into a lion or vice versa. If indeed there is something that prevents such transformation, what is it? Aside from semantics, that a duck that is further branched of a crocodile would be a subset of crocodile class, though it may be very close in DNA to an actual duck. That would not be following DNA phylogenetic then. That would be following species phylogenetic, which makes the theory of evolution almost useless as it requires knowledge of every transformation and nothing can be predicted using available scientific methods and classifications. The phylogenetic tree becomes then just like a world map, where you cannot predict which place lies where unless you have actually gone there, seen it and marked it on the map. It corroborates to actual reality and not to a theory, and all theories are approximations of reality. Which is true for much of a science, however. Switching these trees based on convenience is dishonest and non-intellectual. Onward to third objection.
Secondly, let's take a look at microevolution and macroevolution as defined by Kent Hovind and compare them to how they'd be defined in evolutionary theory. Microevolution is quite similar in both, in that small mutations and adaptations lead to minor differences between organisms. For macroevolution, Kent's definition claims that large mutations are responsible for major differences between organisms, whereas evolutionary theory explains that a great number of small compounding changes are what are responsible for the major differences between organisms. So, according to evolutionary theory, these two terms describe the exact same process. The only difference is the amount of time that's being considered for the observation, micro being a relatively small amount of time while macro is a relatively large amount of time. To draw an analogy, picture a staircase. One step may represent a mutation or very tiny change. Microevolution represents a few of those steps, whereas macroevolution would represent more around 100 or 1,000 of those same steps. Again, these terms refer to the exact same process over differing amounts of time. In specific relevance to this analogy, it's the amount of steps that are considered.
Theory of evolution consists of chiefly two processes: random mutation, which according to their very name are random and thus non-deterministic, and natural selection, which is grossly circular and thus also non-deterministic. This time-based aggregation of microevolution to macroevolution is thus not only a candidate for a fallacy of composition or aggregation problem based on how it is stated, it is demonstrably non-aggregating, holding certain assumptions. Let us discuss aggregation problem first. The aggregation problem refers to the difficulty of treating an empirical or a theoretical aggregate as if it reacted like a less aggregated measure. Treating aggregation of small changes to behave like small changes would behave is fallacious and requires extra argumentation to show why such is possible. Yet a counter to it is shown by an experiment. Yet in short, this conundrum can be explained in a single sentence. When a non-deterministic process interacts with another non-deterministic process non-deterministically, macroevolution equals to microevolution. If this doesn't seem absurd to you, then we are counting on a theory which is essentially non-deterministic and thus useless in explaining what it seeks to explain.